Welcome, everyone. My name is Sana Sharif, and I am the co-president of the Facilitators for Religious, Ethical, and Spiritual Inquiry, also known as FRESI, an interfaith student organization dedicated to creating spaces for spiritual, religious, and ethical dialogue for Harvard students, as well as facilitating student chaplain engagement. I am joined by my fellow FRESI members, Bilal Woori, who also serves as the co-president, Praniti Parikh, Abby McElroy, and Hannah McQuistion. Welcome, everyone. And it's unfortunate to say, but we all would not be gathered here in this forum if not for COVID-19. It has certainly impacted our lives dramatically and taught us a new way of living defined by social distancing, stay-at-home orders, online education, and more. A few weeks prior, we hosted a conversation on how one can lean on faith during these challenging times. We're very privileged to be rejoined by a few of the chaplains and faculty from this previous dialogue. We'd like to welcome Professor Stephanie Paulsell, the Susan Shallcross Swartz Professor of the Practice of Christian Studies at Harvard Divinity School and then term minister at Harvard Memorial Church. She's authored several books, such as Religion Around Virginia Woolf, is co-editor of Goodness and the Literary Imagination, and has served as a regular columnist for the Christian Century since 2007. Her work focuses on religion and literature, Christian spirituality, and the spiritually formative dimensions of the practices of reading and writing. I'd also like to introduce Imam Dr. Khalil Abdur-Rashid, who serves as the first full-time university Muslim chaplain at Harvard, instructor of Muslim Studies at Harvard Divinity School, and adjunct lecturer in public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. He has taught numerous courses on Islam and Islamic law at NYU and Columbia University and Arabic language at Georgia State. He serves the entire Muslim community at Harvard through his mentoring programs, lectures, interfaith work, and the courses he offers in the Divinity School and the Kennedy School. We are also joined by Rabbi Jonah Steinberg, the executive director of Harvard Hillel and a Jewish chaplain at Harvard University. He has served as visiting instructor of Talmud and Rabbinics at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, taught at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies of the American Jewish University, and headed the program in Rabbinic Literature and Civilization at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College before becoming Associate Dean of the Rabbinical School of Hebrew College. Recently, Rabbi Jonah Steinberg received the New Scholar Award from Harvard's Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion for his work. Welcome, chaplains and faculty. Even when we are forced to maintain distance from one another, it is in times of unprecedented change like this that we lean on each other for support more than before. The support of our families, the support of our friends, the support of our colleagues, but most importantly, the support from those leaders who can help us navigate through the uncertainty, provide guidance, and inspire resilience. It's a special honor to be joined by such leaders, President Larry Bacow and Mrs. Adele Fleet Bacow. Thank you both for joining us. Larry Bacow is the 29th president of Harvard University. He was the Hauser Leader in Residence at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government's Center for Public Leadership and served as a member of the Harvard Corporation, the university's principal governing board. One of the most widely experienced leaders in American higher education, known for his commitment to expanding student opportunity, catalyzing academic institutions and innovation, and encouraging universities' civic engagement and service to society. Bacow is the former president of Tufts University and past chancellor and chair of the faculty at MIT. We're also joined by Adele Fleet Bacow. She is a distinguished urban planner specializing in community economic development, design, and the arts. She has founded and currently serves as president of Community Partners Consultants. At the helm of this firm, she has brought the public and private sectors together in unlikely collaborations to revitalize communities, and many of these lessons are presented in her book, Designing the City, A Guide for Advocates and Public Officials. She has received a Federal Design Achievement Award from the President Design Awards Program for her pioneering work. Once again, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Before we dive into the conversation, we will take care of some housekeeping. This event will run for 90 minutes. We will open the floor for questions during the latter part of the discussion, which you can do via the Q&A feature that you will find in the bar on the bottom of your screen. To ask questions, please type them into that feature, and then we'll try to get through most of them, or as many as time will allow. Thank you everyone in advance for your cooperation, and we hope this is an insightful conversation for everyone. So to begin, I want to go back to March 10th, the day when many of us woke up to that email announcing Harvard's plans to de-densify campus. Harvard was one of the first institutions to make this radical move. And I'll be honest, we all were overcome with so many different emotions at that time. In times of uncertainty like that, however, we all look for defining leadership. And in hindsight, that decision was clearly a mark of great leadership. For such a premier institution to make a move that you know will be mimicked by many others, what provided you, President Bacow, with the conviction to stay firm in that decision, which was so unprecedented at the time?
Well, first, let me say thank you for organizing this event, and thank you for inviting Adele and me to participate. We're looking forward to what we hope will be a conversation all the way around. So let me take you back, not to March 10th, but let me take you back to probably the end of January. We had been following what was going on in China with the coronavirus, as it was known at that point, and following it quite closely, in part because we have so many students and faculty who go back and forth to China, students from China. We knew that we would have students coming here at the start of the second semester, and so we were concerned about potentially having people who were already infected on our campus. And we were thinking about what were the public health steps that we needed to take in order to ensure that people were safe and healthy. Along the way, we started monitoring what was going on in Europe as well, as breakouts started to appear in Italy and in Spain. And so, fortunately at Harvard, we have some of the world's foremost experts in epidemiology, infectious disease, public health, virology. And I was able to draw upon what we were learning from them. And it was pretty clear that the virus had established itself in the United States. The University of Washington had already had a breakout on its campus. And in fact, I think was the first university that sent students home and cleared the campus, in effect, because they couldn't figure out how to manage it without doing so. And we were watching as the number of reported cases in Massachusetts continued to grow. And in the 4 days leading up to our announcement, of course, the numbers sound incredibly small now, but I remember them quite well. We went from 13 diagnosed cases in Massachusetts to 28, to 42, to 91. Clearly an exponential growth curve, which was replicating what we had seen in other countries and other parts of the US, which were a bit ahead of us. And so the decision on the 10th was really driven by the timing of spring break. And as you know, spring break was starting at the end of that week. And our concern was that if students left campus for spring break and they went home, but not just home, that they went to places and did things which students typically do on spring break, by the time they came back, again, if you just do the math in terms of the exponential growth rate, we were likely to be overwhelmed with cases on campus. And so it really wasn't a very hard decision to decide the right thing to do was to tell students, if they could, not to come back after spring break. Implementing it was hard. And we had to do we did a number of things in the period leading up to it before we announced that we were doing this. We had to, first of all, we had to make sure that we had the technological capacity to do what we're doing right now, that we had the bandwidth, that we had enough access to Zoom in order to be able to do it. We had to make sure, we realized that if we were likely to have to distribute students, it wouldn't be very long before we'd have to start working remotely. And so literally we tested every major system in the university to make sure that we could operate the university remotely. What do I mean by that? How do we maintain our email system? How do we do accounts payable, accounts receivable? We still have to pay bills, from the university, things like that, basic HR functions. And so we tested all those to make sure that we could do it. And then we held our breath, and we plunged ahead. I would tell you, at the time, I knew that we would be criticized for acting prematurely. And what I said at the time was to people who said that to me, because I should publish the emails I got on March 11th.
No, you shouldn't.
But from students, from faculty, from staff, from parents, people were very, very upset at the time. And my standard response to people who said, we think you're acting prematurely, I said, I really hope you're right and I'm wrong. Because if that were the case, then we'd inconvenience a lot of people and we would squander a lot of resources. But if we didn't act and waited, then literally the cost would be measured in human life. So it wasn't a very difficult decision in that respect. It was because the costs of being wrong were asymmetrical. I'll sound like the economist that I am. But implementing the decision was hard. And we didn't get everything right away. But we tried to fix things when we made mistakes and move it along. So, that's how we did it. There were a lot of people that were involved. In the end, it was my call, but we had a corporation meeting scheduled on March 9th. And I needed to get the permission of the corporation or the acquiescence of the corporation. They were very supportive once we laid out the situation, the data. And I mean, if you're probably not reading the Boston Globe these days, but there was an article in the Globe yesterday about schools that made a similar decision, but a little bit later while their students were still on spring break. And now they have all of the students, their dorm rooms are still filled with all their stuff. They're trying to figure out how they repatriate, students with their belongings. It's quite complicated. So the timing of spring break forced the decision. I also knew that because we were Harvard, that we would probably make it easier for other schools to do the same thing if we acted quickly. And that was also in the back of my mind. So look, if this had turned out to be nothing, we would be having a very different conversation right now. With the benefit of hindsight, it turned out to be the right decision. But I like to say everything comes into sharper focus in the rearview mirror. But at the time, I couldn't be certain it was the right thing. I thought it was the right thing, but.
And time proved that to be true. It was interesting. I was reading that in a Crimson article, I believe, that a previous dean of students had remarked that it takes an act of God for an institution like Harvard to do something like this. And if COVID is not an act of God, then I don't know what it is, to be honest. But that's understandable. And that helps us as students also understand kind of what went behind the decision, which was, I think, and we all, I think, can agree, was very beneficial for everyone.
It's been hard on people, and I recognize that. I mean, it's not easy for all of you. Hannah, I'm sorry that your senior year ended the way it did. Everybody looks forward to their senior year and everything that goes with it. But these are unusual times. I've been spending a lot of time when I can, and I don't have a lot of time, but when I have, to sort of look back and at how Harvard has dealt with, unusual and challenging circumstances in the past. Whether or not it was the Spanish flu pandemic, in 1918, or, during World War II when we, were going double time to educate students so that they could graduate and go off to war, literally. And, each generation, I think, is called upon in some ways to sacrifice. And each generation is challenged in its own way. And, this is the one that all of us are dealing with. It's not easy. But I feel really sorry for students who've had their lives disrupted. and in the way in which you all have. So I apologize for that.
Thank you for that, President Bacow. I'd like to move on to Mrs. Bacow and actually ask you something which I think would be interesting to hear. You spent your life building and revitalizing communities and enhancing community life through design. Communities, unfortunately, are seriously struggling. It's a universal experience. How do you think communities and their rich traditions will survive this? And what kind of imprint do you think this pandemic will leave on the quality of life within community moving forward?
Communities have existed and survived through many crises throughout beginning of time. So I'm 100% confident that communities will continue to flourish. I'm hoping that we can take the lessons of isolating during COVID to the benefit of communities. And what comes to mind most immediately is the ability to work from home, the ability to be flexible. I don't think people really want to do all their work from home, but I never understood why the world was so attuned to a 9 to 5 workday or a 9 to 6 workday, and why we had to have rush hour, why working parents couldn't do some of their work virtually, why everything has to be so crowded and intense. And I think one of the positive lessons from this is that the workplace can be a lot more flexible. Cities have been trying really hard to encourage more pedestrian and bicycle activity. And I think for most of us, the only time we get out of our house is if we're fortunate enough to take a walk around our neighborhood. And so I think we're really understanding the benefit of using our legs once again and not relying all the time on the automobile. And I think that also helps if we can have more staggered work hours. And rethinking sort of what it means to have an office environment. I think offices will always be there and they should be there, but I think there can be more flexibility. I think also with the new urbanism view of city planning, a lot of city planners have been trying to convince cities, and particularly in downtowns, to change some of the old zoning rules so that you can take more advantage of sidewalks for outdoor eating and that sort of thing. And right now we're seeing that happen all the time as they're trying to think about social distancing. Within a few months, I hope that, or a year, who knows, we won't have to worry about social distancing, but I think we can be more creative about uses of public space. And the other thing I've noticed just in the last 2 months of us all being cooped up in our homes and not being on the streets is the environment. Everyone's talking about in Venice, you can actually see things in California. You can, the environment in India, they're talking about sort of the amazing advantages of just the environment lifting up and being able to enjoy that open space. I know personally, I try and take a walk every day, and all of a sudden I'm noticing birds, I'm noticing trees, I'm noticing the flowers that are blooming in ways that I never did before. So I hope that we can appreciate nature more, that we can be wiser about the environment. The other thing that I think may be a bit too idealistic, but I hope desperately that we learn from, is that once again, whenever there's a serious problem with crises, we see the disparities between rich and poor, between people who are people of color, people who have more benefited in society. And it's just so painful to see the disparity of those that are sick, those that don't have the opportunities, those that don't have a backyard to get some fresh air, those that are living, 8 people in a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. It's really hard to stay safe in those kind of environments. And I don't know that we're going to have a magic bullet. Sadly, when things like this happen, we all moan about it. And I don't think there's enough progress in that area, but I pray that people can listen and really think with a new eye on how to change some of that disparities in our society, because I think that's not one that's going to be easily solved at all. I think particularly with the economic devastation that's happening, choices that benefit society get much harder. And I wish I could be more confident to see that the right choices will be made to help people who are more in need. We're seeing it in the short run. You're seeing people wanting to volunteer, helping with food, helping others in need of healthcare. I hope that continues. I pray it continues. I wish I had more confidence that it will meet the way it should be. But I think with people who are graduating from schools, understanding the need for society. I mean, just the fact that you all are doing what you do with public service and perhaps changing your trajectory a bit and what your goals might be professionally to sort of help societies in need would be a really important outgrowth of this very serious and troubling pandemic.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a very interesting point that you bring up. And thankfully, Harvard has such extensive public service opportunities. We have the Phillips Brooks House and other outlets through which we can hopefully extend our services to the community and help out. And as a pre-med student, I'm privy to the inequities that exist within the health system and within the healthcare system, especially those that are related to race and to other markers of identity. And I think it's really, I'm grateful that I am able to be aware of these inequities and hopefully coming out of this institution, move into a space where I can effectively help and effectively harness what I've gotten from classes, from engagements with other students, from extracurriculars in a powerful way. And I think we all here as FRESIs agree with that and hope that we leave here with not just an internship at McKinsey, but as a lot of Harvard students like to say it, but truly a passion and a drive to serve others. I think that's what a lot of Harvard students thankfully are picking up on and are realizing the importance of. So I think it's a very important point. Thank you for bringing that up. I'd like to actually move on to COVID-19, elephant in the room. It has definitely tested us in all aspects of our lives. We've been forced to turn inwards and find something to hold on to during these very challenging and uncertain times. For many, that is a spiritual fortitude of some sort. Chaplains, I'd like to ask you all, what are your thoughts on the role of religious, ethical, and spiritual life on Harvard's campus moving forward, and how can it be most effectively harnessed to support students in times like this? Rabbi Steinberg, do you think we can start with you?
Sure, and Sana, first of all, thank you again for bringing us together. I was asking myself, heading toward this conversation, what do we mean by spiritual resilience? And the answer is right here. This is what we mean by spiritual resilience, which is to say, doing something constructive in the face of adversity. And I'm so grateful to Larry and Adele, to President Bacow and Mrs. Bacow, and to Hannah and Bilal and Pranati and Abby. And also, of course, to Reverend Stephanie and Imam Khalil for being the resilience. I think what we're learning from this time, I'll play the part of a Talmud teacher for a moment. There's a story toward the very beginning of the Talmud, at least as it comes down to us, that is a story. It actually has to do with sidewalks in a way. I was thinking of it as Adele was speaking. It's a story of a rabbi who lived in the time after the devastation of Jerusalem at the hands of the Roman legions. And the story says, it's told in the voice of this Rabbi Yossi, who says, once I was walking on the road, I was walking on the path, and I ducked into a ruin among the ruins of Jerusalem to pray. And so you sort of picture that image. Here is the rabbi walking through the devastation, and it's the time for prayer, and he finds a ruin in which to pray. The continuation of the story, by the way, reveals to us that the divine is kind of hanging out in that ruin as well, and so is Elijah the prophet. And Elijah the prophet instructs the rabbi that really he ought to pray on the road. He ought to figure out a way of praying on the path. It's incumbent upon you to figure out how to live your spiritual life while remaining underway, right? So in a certain sense, in this time, we are homing into the familiar, sort of our spirits are somehow hanging out in and around the yard, if you like. I mean, that exists in our souls. And when we come together like this, we are virtually or in some sense actually populating a Harvard. But it is incumbent upon us to figure out how to lead our lives on the road, wherever it is taking us. And so along with the Backows, and especially what Adele just said in terms of lessons to take forward from this time, I hope it adds dynamism, right? I mean, Harvard is a place of over 3 3/4 century of tradition, right? Also a lot of change in that time, but things we've become very accustomed to being the way we are, being the way, you know, students come and experience Harvard, and it's something that's been there from time out of mind. This has given the whole thing a great big shake, as though someone picked up the corners of the carpet and just, you know, flipped the thing. You know, you began this, Sana, by saying if it wasn't for COVID-19, we wouldn't all be here, right? There's a lachrymose, there's a mournful way of saying that, and there's a constructive way of saying it. None of us would have wished for a pandemic, of course, or for the suffering that we see and experience all around us. But this very moment is teaching us new possibilities. And so that's what I hope it adds to campus when we have a campus again, is the sense that it needn't always be the way it was yesterday. Perforce, we're inventing it anew right now, but we can choose to invent it anew each and every day. You know, the Jewish liturgy gives us this notion of the divine renewing every day the work of creation. So we have a creation story, an ancient story of 7 days and then a day of rest, and that might lead you to think things are the way they are, and that's what is. But we renew it, we refresh it. So I'm hoping that this time brings us back into the world when we're able to re-enter it again with a lot of sense of possibility.
Yeah, I hope for the same, Rabbi Steinberg. Very well said. Would Imam Khalil or Professor Pausel care to add to that, or if there's anything else they'd like to say?
Oh. Khalil, do you want to go first, or?
No, go ahead, Stephanie, please.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Sana and Bilal, for organizing these great webinars. I've really enjoyed them. And thank you, Jonah. I love being a student in your Talmud class anytime. I've been rereading a book by Dorothy Day, who was an American Catholic woman in the 20th century who started what she called houses of hospitality in American cities. She started in New York, where to meet people's needs, to meet the needs of people who were homeless, who didn't have enough to eat, who needed various sorts of help, but also to live alongside them, to study with them, to think about changing the world together. And one of the most formative experiences of her life was as a young person being in San Francisco during the big earthquake. And what really stayed with her was not the terror of the earthquake, but the way everybody helped each other afterwards. People ran into buildings to rescue children. People brought meals to each other. People invited people into their homes when their apartment building had been destroyed. And that is the thing that really shaped her life and set her on this path. She became a journalist, she became a communist, she eventually became a Catholic who founded this movement called the Catholic Worker Movement and opened all of these homes for people who needed homes. And like Adele, I'm really hopeful that we'll come out of this learning these kinds of lessons, but I'm also nervous about not learning them and not bringing them forward. You know, this is an unusual experience in that we're all experiencing it, but some people are more vulnerable than others, and we're not all experiencing it in the same way. And so I think sometimes it's hard to to feel, okay, by staying home, I'm actually doing something for somebody else. And I think that's where faith communities can really help. I mean, faith is something that comes to life in community. And what Dorothy Day said, she said, the only solution is love, and love comes with community. Love comes from community. And so I hope that our faith communities can help us really reflect on the invisible connections that run between us, because that is something a crisis like this can do, is illuminate those connections that we can't always see. And I think it's the work of people of faith and the work of faith communities to lift those up even more, and to illuminate how much we are in each other's care, which this pandemic has really shown us. It really does matter if we stay home or not. It matters to doctors, nurses, grocery workers, people delivering the mail. It really does matter, but it can be a little hard to see. And so I think that's part of our work. I also think, just Son, in response to your question about what religious life ought to look like on campus, I think first and foremost, I think we need to make sure everyone is held somehow between chaplains, the houses, faculty, classes, administrators, groups like FRESI. We've got to make sure that everyone is in community somehow. And of course, we're going to need to mourn each other's losses. There's lots of different kinds of loss that we're experiencing. And we'll need a way together, I think, to mourn when we're back.
That would definitely be this collective mourning of loss, and is I think would be very beneficial and very cathartic for a lot of students going back to campus. I'm curious to know how that may manifest. How do we see that happening or materializing? Hopefully when we do get back on campus, everything is very uncertain right now, of course. And that uncertainty remains because everything we don't have much control in this situation. But how do we see that kind of collective mourning happening? I'm curious to hear your perspective on that.
I think right now different communities are trying to figure out what resources they have, what rituals need to happen. And now I think we're getting to the point where we need to be more in conversation with each other. Khalil and Jonah and I will be meeting this week to talk about this, among other things, about the religious landscape of the campus and how we can bring the religious resources, the resources of faith, to bear on this question. But of course, it needs to be even broader than that. So I think at this point, the conversations are, Wes Kahn and Laura Glass at Memorial Church, who run the grief group there, are doing a lot of work in gathering resources. Tammy and Pat McLeod, whom we heard from at your last wonderful webinar, they are doing that, working with CAMS. But I think the connections now need to start to be made, the interfaith connections, which is what I think you all, FRESI, are calling us to.
No, that's wonderful. Imam Khalil, would you like to add?
Yeah, thank you, Sana, and thank you, everybody. President and Ms. Adele Bacow, it's very good to see you. Thank you for your leadership, your stewardship throughout all of this, your care for all of us as community members. We're deeply grateful to what you stand for, the decisions you've made, and the amount of difficulty and burdens you've endured to make sure we're all safe. And first of all, I know I speak for my dear colleague, Rabbi Jonah, and Professor Paul Sell, and all of us in saying that we are deeply grateful to you both for being healthy, for getting through COVID-19, and we continue to send our thoughts and wishes and blessings to both of you. You are inspirations in showing us what it's like to go through challenging times and to come out resilient. And I think that is, an example for all of us. I think what I would have to say in addition to that, just echoing what Rabbi Jonah said and Professor Stephanie Paulsell, is that, the notion of resilience is really important to highlight in terms of faith communities on campus. Resilience, wellness, and healing. Because no matter how, you define success, and certainly Harvard is a place where folks think about success, talk about leadership and how to change the world in grand narratives. But no matter, how grand a person's vision and goals are, the human experience will always and inevitably involve an encounter with trials and difficulties and challenges. And I think one of the greatest skills and tool sets that leaders of religious and spiritual and ethical life can help students discover is the skill of being resilient, the skill of healing, the skill of pursuing wellness and mindfulness and faith in the midst of trials and difficulties and, shall we say, life's challenges. It's one thing to talk about success, but it's another thing to train and educate ourselves about failure. And failure is just as great of a teacher as success is. And it's not necessarily that failure itself is the teacher, but it's the lessons contained in the mistakes that we've made or others made. Whether those others are ourselves or, our parents or folks in different traditions and history that we read about. So I think, what I see in terms of our vision for religious life on campus, complementing Professor Paulsell's and Rabbi Jonah's discussion and vision, is the idea that, students, when they encounter faith communities that become more and more spacious on campus, what does that mean practically speaking? Well, it means students encounter a community of folks that are constantly in dialogue about how to mine the human treasures and the human reservoirs for discoveries about how to get through life's greatest challenges. And that includes, how do we anchor ourselves when we are decoupled from our traditional roots, when financial crisis, global crisis, and personal crisis tend to, send us packing and send us and going in different directions where we think where we forget to get our bearings or we don't know where to get our bearings. Well, these communities foster climates where, students and even faculty and staff members can come and think about what's most important in life and how to navigate challenges they're having personally or their colleagues are having, and how they can be more productive and shaping personal, collective, family, and even national and global resilience and health in the spiritual sense and well-being. And that is one meaning that I'd like to insert in terms of the definition of community. That community is not just a place where we sit and talk, but more but in addition to that, a space where we sit and talk. And when we leave those spaces, we leave them with a better notion of what it means to be human.
If I could jump in here and just follow that up, I think one of the really interesting consequences of all of this is that it's made a lot of people visible to folks who in the past may have been invisible. The folks who literally put the food on the shelf in the grocery store, the people who check you out at the grocery store, those who deliver the mail. We take a lot for granted, and all of us are privileged to live the lives that we lead, but we are so much dependent upon so many others, and we often fail to see and to recognize how those people are contributing and making possible of the life that we lead, and how much we owe them and we are dependent upon them. the first responders, the nurses in the hospitals, not just the nurses in the hospitals, but the people who were, the orderlies in the hospitals, those who are making food for the people in the hospitals. So, it's my hope that we have a more expansive view of community on the other side of this, that people pause and sort of recognize that, we're all in this together, and that, we can't just be only concerned about ourselves and our own narrow little world. And I'm an optimist, and I'd like to believe that on the other side of this, when we finally reach it, we'll recognize the dignity of honest work and our reliance and dependence upon others as well. And we'll go out of our way to do more for those who I think have certainly, speaking now as an economist, over the last 20 or 30 years, have been steadily losing ground to everybody else.
No, that's wonderful. And as a Harvard student myself, I'm going to be honest that it happens where I'm in the Harvard bubble, and the only things that preoccupy my mind are those academic worries that I have in front of me, the exam that I have coming up, the paper that I have to get in, the research proposal I need to work on, and really everything, all of the other interactions that I have tend to go unappreciated. And I think it's coming back home and realizing the void that not being on campus has left has made me reevaluate what exactly campus means and what exactly that community within campus means and what it entails. All of the people who make campus a home for me, it's becoming more apparent, thankfully. And I'm glad you brought that up, especially for those students who are listening in. I wanted to ask you both, actually, President Bacow and Mrs. Bacow, if you could speak on the role that faith plays in your life and your experiences in general. That I think that would be very interesting to hear for us all.
I'll start.
Why don't you go first?
Well, we are both very deeply Jewish, and I would say spiritual with a small s in our life day to day. It's always been an important identifier of who we are. I think given the busy, hectic lives that we all lead, and I don't mean just being president of Harvard, but just anyone who's listening or participating has busy, crazy lives. The concept of having the Sabbath in whatever way that's meaningful to you, or a day of contemplation, has really been important to our life. But I think also the values for us about Judaism, which I think many faith communities share, about looking out for community, looking out for people other than yourselves. We always talk about tikkun olam, or repairing the world, and I think anyone who cares enough to be involved in your group or participate in the Zoom lives that daily, most likely, or hopes to in the future, is really what keeps us centered. I think in a nutshell, that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I would just add to that we're deeply involved in our own synagogue, Temple Emmanuel in Newton, and our regulars there. And that's an important community for us. It's important both because it's a place where we can go candidly and just be Adele and Larry, because people have known us there for 35 or more years that we've belonged there, and get out of these fancy roles as opposed to being president and, Mrs. Bacow. It's just Adele and Larry. That's nice. But also it's I'll just reiterate what Adele said. I think it's no surprise, obviously, that the three Abrahamic religions have embraced the notion of a Sabbath. But if you take a look at most religious traditions, I mean, the Eastern religions set aside time for contemplation and reflection. And I think it's almost Darwinian that we need the opportunity to hit the pause button from time to time, that we need to remove ourselves from our daily routine, that we need to reflect upon what is our role in a larger world. And so I think, we get that from our faith tradition, but it's expressed in, I think, virtually every faith tradition.
No, that's great. Because a lot of thoughts are kind of coming up on what does ritual look like and what does community look like, especially within faith communities when there are no congregations, when there is a lack of physical gatherings that can bring faith communities together. And I would love it if the chaplains could comment on how and shed some light on these redefinitions of ritual within communities of faith and what that's looking like and manifesting now. And whether or not it may have a lasting impact on communities of faith and religion moving forward. Rabbi Steinberg, if we can start with you, that would be great.
Sure. There's I was just trying to remind myself the name of the author of a classic book on the shtetl, on the Eastern European Jewish village, and the title of the book so aptly is "Life is with People." Mark Zborowski, I think, is the author of the book. Jewish life is very much with people. I'm sure that's true of all the traditions represented here. But there are certain things in Jewish tradition for which traditionally one requires a community, one requires a quorum. And this is a challenging time for Jewish community, especially because the Sabbath that Adele and Larry were speaking of is observed by some in Jewish tradition as a Sabbath from what we're doing right now, at least as it involves electronics and devices. It's a day of not ancient in ancient terms of not kindling fire, and some understand that as not flipping on and off devices. And for Jews who observe that way, and I never intended, for instance, to be such a Luddite once a week as it turns out to be, but since college, I've had this 25-hour respite from the more and more insistent electronic world, right? And that's worked so long as it could be a respite from the electronic to come together in the actual, right? A time when it's really about putting down the iPhone and closing the laptop and being with the human being who's right there in the community of human beings. So not all Jews observe that way, of course. There's tremendous variety within and many legitimate ways of making Sabbath. But one thing we're discovering as a Harvard Hillel community across our denominations, and this past week we had a beautiful interminyan, which is to say all the denominations represented in Harvard Hillel coming together to welcome the Sabbath together before sundown. And we've also had these exiting the Sabbath experiences of Havdalah, this beautiful ritual that's done with spices and with a candle and with a cup of wine, a very sensory experience that's also challenged by distance, but by framing that time, before and leading into it and after, and reminding one another to go out on a walk, to enjoy as much as we can what is. There are so what I'm getting at is there are severe challenges, and I'm sure this exists across our various traditions. I mean, I'm so mindful of Imam Khalil's community observing Ramadan in a time when gatherings aren't possible. And what does that look like every evening? Well, perhaps in families, but there's more to it than that. We had, we went through Passover as a community this way. It can be terribly lonely. It can be terribly isolating because life is with people. And so even if one's form of observance precludes the electronic on the Sabbath itself, becomes all the more important to bracket that experience with togetherness, because otherwise, it's not meant to be punitive, the Sabbath. You know what I mean? It's meant to be a delight. Sure, we have rules and regulations that safeguard it, but those are meant to safeguard a time that is a holy of holies, which is an experience of encounter. And so we're finding new ways. And again, I come back to what the way you framed this conversation, which is about resilience. We've learned a lot about what's necessary to sustain. I mean, I've been to several baby namings and several memorial gatherings online during this time, and I've been surprised how not virtual but actual they have been. It's not a substitute for being really together. And I'm looking at Larry and Adele sitting on the couch, you know, together. What togetherness is so very, very essential, and it's one of the things I admire so much in your leadership, Adele and Larry, is the togetherness you model in it. And this is a time that is that is, on the one hand, perhaps throwing us back together with family in ways we didn't anticipate, and there's that whole bit. But it's challenging the togetherness that we've chosen as adults in a lot of instances.
Don't you, Jonal? I'm sorry to interrupt, but
no, please.
I think a lot of people are also taking advantage of this opportunity. Well, in part because everybody is separated, they're going out of their way to reconnect with old friends, to set up Zoom meetings, you know, gatherings and stuff. So there's this necessity to be together, to be with other people. And at least, you know, in our synagogue, which is now taken services online, we found that the number of people participating has just grown because, you know, people have the, you know, it's easy to do it. You just click on and you're there.
You're so right.
You don't have to go someplace. So I do think that there are some silver linings, at least in the sense of people finding new ways to connect.
For sure. I mean, I have 4 high school friends. We've been friends since we were, actually middle school friends. We've been friends since we were 13 years old. Friends whom both of my parents still refer to as the boys. You know, if my mom or my dad ask, have you seen any of the boys recently? You know, they mean Mohammed and Michael and Philip and Florian. And we usually get together once or twice a year. We're all geographically dispersed. We weren't going to be able to do that this year. So we wound up hanging out on Zoom and kicking ourselves. Why don't we do this? You know, usually we get together to go skiing somewhere. You know, we grew up in Austria, so we're used to ski trips, and that's been the thing. But it took COVID-19 to get us seeing one another's faces in this kind of a way.
That's wonderful. I actually wanted to extend this question to the rest of the FRESIs as well, and ask you guys, what do you do to stay grounded, and as well as you, President and Mrs. Bacow, what are some of these practices? Take us through them. How do you stay kind of grounded, as I had asked before?
Well, I'd really love to hear from the students on the call that we haven't heard from. We've been doing a lot of talking, so please.
I can say something to that just briefly. I feel like in my personal life, when things have been tough, and now especially dealing with all of the changes that are coming with COVID and the uncertainty that I think we all see ahead of us, for me, I feel like it strips away a lot of the less essential things, and you are reminded of the things that really matter. And I feel like it's a lot easier to be grateful for the things that you do have when you're reminded of the things that you no longer have. So for me, just like relying on friends and family and my health right now, just things that I do have that I can be grateful for, as well as relying on my faith and just praying for those that I care about, and just trying to stay positive and hopeful, and just feel like things normally seem to work out in the best in the end. And that a lot of times you can't see it when you're in it, but once you're through it, you can look back and just see how valuable the struggle was. And when you get out of it on the other side, that there is so much that you can learn from the difficult times in your life.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Bilal. All you.
Sure. I definitely want to echo that. As you've mentioned, like this crisis has definitely hindered our communication and our interaction in a lot of ways, but it's also facilitated them in a lot of ways as well. And while our communities can't gather physically to worship, to socialize, like we're still being proactive and resilient by engaging one another in these sorts of formats, and that's been really grounding for me, especially in these times. And I'm really grateful to be surrounded by individuals and by a community with this capacity and empathy to keep us connected. So that's something that's really been touching and grounding.
I've been thinking a lot about um, things that I think, as Hannah was saying, and also as Mrs. Bacow was saying earlier, about being able to take a walk and just noticing the trees and the flowers in a way that you haven't before. So like trying to find the silver lining, trying to figure out, like the grass, the flowers, that has been really, really actually what take, like finding out new hobbies. Like I decided that I would do one of my final projects as a painting and not as a paper, and I'm really grateful that the professor offered that sort of like creative opportunity. But that also helped me a lot. Like I think I'm cutting out, but I think those sorts of like discovering the little things that can bring joy every day, whether that's just like noticing that it's nice out and that the windows can be opened, that is honestly has been really refreshing to do.
It's lovely. I've also just been trying to, I think, spending time with the family during Ramadan with this kind of spiritual, I mean, Ramadan is a holiday that is defined by going to the mosque and interacting with the entire Muslim community and breaking fast together and praying Tarawih together, or the nightly prayers. And when that's lacking, I think honestly it truly helps strengthen the connection with those who you are in contact with. In this case, my immediate family. And I think it's been a very beneficial time. And as college students, we weren't expecting to be home for Ramadan for another probably few years. Like this wasn't going to happen soon. So it truly was a blessing in disguise. And it's lovely that it's working out such as, or it's working out like it is. I was wondering how you both stay grounded as well. What are some of the things that are helping you during this time?
We're blessed to have our grandchildren here, which we never anticipated to have. And while I must say it's exhausting running after a 2.5-year-old, it is a joy to get to know them in a different way. Larry's working night and day, and I'll let him speak for himself. So he doesn't have as much time, I think, to do the things that I can do. I think we both made an effort to reach out to family and friends more than we ever had, as we were talking about earlier with Zoom. And Friday, I shocked myself. I did something I haven't done in years, and I baked 2 challahs for Shabbat. So, having that extra time, for me anyway, is sort of enabling me to do things that I love to do: reading, exercise, playing the piano, being with friends and family, although virtually. It's still rewarding when you connect. How about you?
Yeah, well, as Adele said, I've probably never worked harder than I have in my entire life that I am right now. I'm envious of those who say they have time to read a book, to watch movies. Candidly, I'm not doing that. My day starts very early. It tends to end very late. I have made a point of really trying to get some exercise literally every day. And that was not the case. I mean, I'm a runner, and so I've routinely run, even during my time as president, but not as regularly as I am right now. We've eliminated all commuting, right? So there's more time in the day because of that. I'm not traveling, and it's you know, Adele and I get to see each other a lot more these days than, you know, is typically the case.
Pardon me while I laugh. He's in his office with the door shut often, but we do see each other.
I am, but at least I'm not on the road, right?
That's true.
I'm not traveling. We have dinner together every night. We have breakfast together every morning.
Yeah,
right?
That's true. That's true. It's all true.
That's normally not the case. And you know, like Jonah, we have these regular sessions that we get together with. You know, I get together with my college roommates and their spouses, and the other day we did something. We do it at the same time each week. And then last week, what we did is that we invited all of our children to join the same Zoom call. So, and of course, everybody knows everybody else's kids. We've all grown up with them, and their kids as well. So there were something like, what did we count? 15 grandchildren, you know, on the call. So it was fun. So that keeps us centered.
Right. And in fact, tomorrow night we're having, I forget which night, but one night we had all Larry's adult cousins on Zoom from all over the country, which we have never done before. And we all sort of joke, you know, you see them at weddings and bar mitzvahs, and you know what those conversations are like. But it was really fun. And then we're having one with my cousins in a few days, and we'd never done that before other than family events. So, you know, that's sort of nice to reach out in ways that we don't typically do.
But I think it, you know, at times like this, those conversations are really important. It does keep you centered. And at least for me, it's a chance to remove myself from, you know, the endless decisions and complexity and uncertainty that's sort of shrouding everything as we try and figure out how we're going to move forward, you know, both this fall and beyond. So it's nice to be able to withdraw from that and just be with people who aren't worrying about that.
Yeah. No, I would completely agree with that, especially with that point you brought up about cousins. It's wonderful what quarantine can do for a family. I was, now it's nearing the latter portion of the event, so we're going to transition into questions from the audience now. And I'd like to remind the audience that the question and answer feature is still open, and we'd love for you all to submit any more questions that you have. We'll get started with the questions that we have right now, and the other, my lovely FRESI colleagues will be asking you those questions that are submitted.
So I will be introducing the first question, and this question comes from Monica Chang in the audience, and it's directed at all of our participants, all of our panelists. The question is, what are some verses or parts of scriptural text that you have found yourself going back to, or which have brought particular comfort and healing during this unprecedented time? So whoever would like to begin, free to jump in.
I would defer to the professionals.
So I have a weekly study session with Rebecca Thrope, class of 22, whom some of you may know in the college, and we've been looking at the book of Ecclesiastes together. And I keep on coming back to L'chol hazman va'et. There is a season for everything and a time for every purpose under the heavens. When we just wish for the times to be other than what they are, that's when I think we run up against the futility, frankly, that Ecclesiastes is very fixated on. But when we make the most of the moment that we're given, then, you know, the fact that whatever we build up may get knocked down is less consequential, because we find uplift and togetherness in the moment. So this is a, you know, among the list of times and seasons that Ecclesiastes mentions is a time to refrain from embracing, et lirchok mechabek, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. This struck me very early on that in some ways this was a time to refrain from embracing, but that there could be uplift in such a time is a revelation of its own sort.
Wonderful. Imam Khulila, Professor Paulsell.
Yeah, I can speak certainly to a piece of scripture that that is keeps me going, and there's every night we do a session, but one in particular, it talks about how to be strong and resilient in tough times, and how to remember those in the past that have gone through difficulties, and that their legacy, their life, it's still they're still living, they're still present, and to draw upon lessons in the past, from the past, to keep you going through the challenges that are ahead. And so it goes, O believers, O people of faith, seek strength and support through strong endurance, patient endurance, and in prayer. That the divine God is with those who patiently endure through difficulties. And don't think that those who have passed away before you, that they are truly, dead and gone, but they are alive and they are being provided for. You will encounter trials and tests by way of fear, hunger, loss of life, loss of wealth, and loss of productivity. But you must patiently endure and give glad tidings and good news to those who patiently endure. And those who remember that they have come from the divine, they will return to the divine as well. And so that's the piece of scripture that I try to keep in mind when things are a bit challenging.
Those are beautiful. I have thought a lot in this time about a verse from one of the letters in the New Testament that says, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Because this is so much a pandemic of the unseen. We can't, if we could see it, we could see the virus, we would know how to stop it. We could stop its spread, but you can't see it. And so, as Larry said so beautifully, we owe it to each other to protect each other by wearing masks and staying home and doing things we might not otherwise want to do, but on behalf of others, because of the unseen connections that run between us that we can't always track. And I've been trying to think lately about what other unseen things, less scary unseen things than the virus, but the way that love communicates itself, how it can too become contagious and spread, and that's something that's given me a lot of hope in this time.
Wonderful. We're going to move on to the next question, which I believe Pranati will be asking. Oh no, technical difficulties.
Yeah, so, oh no, is it still?
No.
Okay, so the next question, also from the audience, a couple of people are curious about this. We're addressing the question to President and Mrs. Bacow. How did your faith give you added strength or resilience when you were dealing with coronavirus? Did you start seeing any element of that faith in a new light?
We got a lot of support from people who just wrote us, who told us that they were keeping us in their thoughts and their prayers. We must have received literally at least 1,000 messages from, some were from friends and family and, folks who had just heard that we were sick, but many just from across the broader Harvard community. And I think that was enormously reassuring and supportive while we were going through it. But I also think that, but you should speak to this. You were talking about this earlier.
I would say that Larry and I both are eternal optimists. And when we've had health issues in the past, or people we care about have health issues, we tend not to be alarmist and don't let ourselves go with the worst that might happen, and just sort of get through it. And so to be honest, I mean, I think that thank God we did not have to be hospitalized. We weren't by ourselves. We weren't on a ventilator. We would
We
give
get
you
access to the world's best healthcare.
Yeah, but I mean, we didn't need it. You know, we were in home, we were in bed, we took care of ourselves. We got better, thank goodness. I would give you a different answer, I think, if I'd have been by myself in a hospital with a ventilator. But since I did not have that experience, and neither did Larry, it was more just feeling lousy, sleeping, you know, getting through the day. But it wasn't like we ever let ourselves think, are we not going to be here tomorrow? If we had reason to think that, to be honest, I think we would have had to dig deeper in our faith. And when we've had crises in our life, deaths of people that we love and that sort of thing, those were the times for us where we had to dig deeper in our faith and had friends and family and clergy that really held us up. For us, we didn't go there with our bout of COVID. I think other people had it much worse. And those situations would be ones where faith for us would have been essential in a deep way to keep us through it.
I'm sure though, within the uncertainty that you felt of just the possibility of it and the ramifications of having COVID, being in your position, I'm sure there must have been some semblance of that, of maybe a little bit more of a deepening connection to it, and maybe just more of a, like more of that, more of being in tune with it. I don't know, but it's fantastic, and we all are so happy that you all are healthy, that you are with us today, that you came out of it more resilient than before, and we're just happy to have you and that you are healthy.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And you all stay healthy as well.
Yeah. Or as I like to say, you should do a better job of staying healthy than we did.
We will try our very best. Let's move on to the next question.
Our next question is from audience member Fausia Ratza, and she wants to ask all of the panelists what words of advice they have to offer to students who are right now feeling highly anxious about the coming fall semester.
It would be fantastic to hear from the Backows, President
Okay.
Bacow. Sorry to spotlight you.
So, first of all, I understand how challenging the uncertainty is, you know, for people at the moment, and that in and of itself can be difficult. That uncertainty is going to resolve itself one way or the other in the next several weeks. And by July 1 or shortly thereafter, we'll know exactly what we're doing. If it's the case that we are back on campus, it's going to be different for people. It's not going to be the same as it was before. People are likely to be masked. People are likely to still have to engage in a certain amount of social distancing. It will be a different experience for students if we're back on campus. If we're not on campus and we start remotely, it will also be different from what students experienced this spring. Because this spring, the faculty literally had, about 10 days to prepare to go online. They didn't have a chance to really design courses from the ground up. I think, we'll do better this time around. We want to bring people back as soon as it is safe to do so. And when I say safe, not just for our students, but safe for the faculty and staff and others, the people who work in the dining halls, the people who clean the houses and others as well. So I would say the way to deal with the anxiety, my mother had a wonderful expression, okay? And Jonah and Stephanie and Khalil know this. My mother was a survivor of the Holocaust. She was a survivor of Auschwitz. And she had lost her entire family. She was the only one who survived. And when I was a kid growing up and I would worry about things, my mother would say to me, Larry, what's the worst thing that can happen? Can you live with that? If so, why worry? And of course, what was unsaid was that she had survived literally the worst thing that could happen to anybody. So I think that, rather than feel sorry for what one has lost, I think it's important to sort of focus on the positive and sort of say, this is our challenge. We will get through it. There will be support that we will have from each other, from our families, hopefully from Harvard as well. It won't go on forever. At some point, it will be over. I would like to tell you, I know when. I don't. That's a function of our ability to develop, a vaccine, treatment therapies, and other things. But every generation has been tested. Every generation has been challenged. And I just have enormous confidence in your generation. You guys are committed to making the world a better place. I'm always impressed. The single most frequent co-curricular activity for students who are applying to Harvard College is public service. And so I think that, you will find your way. And it's important to be able to verbalize your anxieties, to draw strength from others and to come together. But, I think we'll all make it through this.
I would say too that everyone's feeling anxious. You articulated it, the questioner articulated it, and anxiety about what it's going to be like coming back to campus. But I think anyone who's going through this is anxious about your future. You're anxious about the health of your parents, your grandparents, your own health.
Getting a job,
the economy, what's it going to mean? And that expresses itself in small ways and in big ways. And I keep thinking back to a story that our rabbi told in a recent Zoom sermon, which was, and I think for a lot of students, you're home living with perhaps your family, ways that, at what college age you're not used to being home for 2 months at a time, perhaps, or those with roommates or whatever your living situation is. It's not probably the norm that you expect. And so he had some good advice that another rabbinical colleague told him, and to think about what are you doing that's driving people crazy in your household, and try and do less of it. And on the other side, what are you doing that's bringing people joy, and try and bring more joy in whatever ways you can do that. And I think if we can take those lessons to us, whether you're back on campus, whether you're home, in your room or in the basement, wherever it is that you're, stuck with your laptop trying to do courses, and making life as normal as possible. And I think with anxiety too, there's a lot of stress. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to give everybody a lot more slack than we typically do, which I think is hard to do when we're all so anxious. But to the extent that we can give people the benefit of a doubt, or go, they're as anxious as I am, and maybe I won't blow up as quickly as I usually do, I think will help us as we try and sort through. And I do believe that this is not going to last forever, although it feels like it does. But once we have a better idea of scheduling and the future in whatever miraculous way we can figure it out, then I think we'll adapt to it. I think right now it's just the uncertainty of not knowing. And we can't wait until we have a better handle on that, which will happen.
I also would like to share with you some wisdom that we got from Adele's mother when we got married. And I think it's actually quite helpful right now for families that are living in extraordinarily close proximity, right? Adele's mother, when we got married, said to each of us, treat your spouse as well as you would treat a stranger. And, the reality is that we tend to often treat strangers far better than the people that we love. We take the people that we love for granted often. We don't give them the benefit of the doubt. There's a certain familiarity that allows us to sometimes say things to them that we would never dream of saying to a stranger. And so, I would say we should all treat our family members that we are now living with under close conditions with the same respect and the same politeness that we would treat a stranger. And I think if we do that, it will also sort of tend to make life a little bit easier. Because let's face it, we're all ready to do something different than we're doing right now, but this is what we have to do to keep everyone safe.
That's wonderful. I know I can definitely implement that in my daily life. We'd love to entertain another question before we wrap up. Let's move into I believe, Bilal, you have a question to ask.
Yes, yes, I'll do that. So this is primarily addressed to President Bacow and Mrs. Bacow. Thank you again for your time. So in addition to our spiritual communities coming together and our ability to draw strength and resilience from that, will investments be made in Harvard's mental health infrastructure this upcoming fall to address mental health challenges exacerbated during this crisis for students?
It's a really good question, Bilal. And the answer is yes. I mean, look, we all understand that people are stressed right now. And, we're looking to see, for example, where everybody's going to be and how to organize things correctly. But one of the things which we're doing is looking across the board at our capacity to deal with the mental health, but also the physical health of our students and faculty and staff for when people come back to campus. Part of the calculation is making sure that we have the facilities to support people and their needs, which are going to be more demanding than they have been in the past. Whether or not it's mental health or, if we bring people back and we get a breakout on campus, how do we isolate people? How do we provide food to them? How do we take care of them if they have to be quarantined? And especially if we have large numbers of people who have to do that. So this is some of the planning that we're engaged in right now as we speak.
That's wonderful. I do know, and I can comment a little bit on the importance of mental health, as it has been an interest of mine of late, but I can also comment on the intersection between faith and mental health, and how there has been quite a bit of research on the spiritualization of medicine. There's actually an institute at MGH known as the Henry Benson Institute, and they focus on how religious practices and practices of meditation, and whether or not they are associated with a religious context or not, can really help in health outcomes, decrease in blood pressure, decrease in cholesterol, decrease in heartbeat, and really enable this calming effect. So it's helped me quite a lot from my experience. Meditative practices and practices of kind of focus on and prayer, really just focus on prayer, has, to be honest, helped with the easing of the tension. And I'd recommend it to those who are listening in, because there has been extensive research on it showing it to be effective and really help with maybe any mental health issues one must be facing. Of course, this is not a panacea for mental health issues. That's not what I'm saying, but it may help those who are experiencing mental health symptoms or kind of a difficulty in their mental health, whether it be anxiety, depression, or other mental health disorders. So that's just kind of my 2 cents on the topic. But it's a fantastic question and a really important topic to discuss as we move forward. I think we can entertain one last question before we end today's webinar. So Hannah, I believe you have the next question.
Sure. We have a question from Professor Eck in the audience, which is, do you think all of us in our communities will need to think more deeply about the relationship of our faith and science? They also referenced a documentary that's coming out this Tuesday with the Dalai Lama as a scientist.
I think,
Do you want to take that one?
Well, it raises a question for me that I wanted to ask you, Larry, if I may, which is, it was really wonderful to hear you talk about making the decision for March 10th and all that led up to that. And I know that you have a lot more decisions to make, and they'll affect different people in different ways. You make a decision and it meets a need over here, maybe it creates another need over here. And I know you've been relying on science, and we're also grateful that you have been, that's been really bedrock to these decisions. But I wanted to ask about the role of your faith in navigating these decisions that maybe science can't quite get you all the way there, you know, where you've got competing goods, where you've got where you're following the science, but you know that it will make something harder for somebody. How do you navigate all of that?
Well, I don't know if you and Diana got together on this question, but thank you first, Diana, thank you for the question. And Stephanie, thanks for your take on the question. You know, right now it seems like every decision that we face, they're all Hobson's choices. They're all bad choices. And the path is never clear. And so, you know, in thinking about those, obviously one tries to get the best information available. And I tend to be a very analytic person. So I think about things in terms of probabilities. I think about things in terms of decision trees. I think about asymmetric outcomes. You know, so I approach it that way. But, you know, we talked earlier about passages from scripture. And one of my favorites, Jonah, is tzedek, tzedek toldot, all right? Justice, justice you shall pursue. And so when all else, you know, is equal, I mean, you try and sort of say, what is the just thing to do? What is the right thing to do? And for whom? Because as we, you know, let's take this conversation back to where we started. And I think, you know, with the observation that this has laid bare I think you made the point, Adele, the inequities that exist in society. And so in the end, there's an opportunity to try and nudge things in the right direction. And, you know, if I'm going to be wrong, I'd rather be wrong by trying to do justice than be wrong for other reasons.
and that's a wonderful line of thinking that I think we all would assume and should assume. Of course, being in your position, we can't imagine the decisions that you will have to face in the coming months, but what we can do is thank you for everything that you've done for us and for keeping our safety and our health in mind moving forward. So it truly means a lot to all of us, as students, to the faculty, to the chaplains. And with that, I'm going to thank everyone for joining us today in this very hopeful and very insightful conversation. On behalf of FRESI and the Harvard Chaplains, I once again want to sincerely thank you, President Bacow and Mrs. Bacow, for sharing your perspective and for offering some insight on how faith can be a valuable driving force and a hopeful respite during these challenging times and very uncertain times. We may not be in the front lines right now, but we're doing our own part by self-isolating in spite of the many struggles that can come from doing so. The way that I see it is that the more profound the intention, the more profound the reward will be in the end. And I really hope that we all can understand this moving forward, and hopefully the ease will come with time. With that, I'd like to wish everyone good health and safety and a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and I'll be ending the conversation now.
Thank you for organizing this.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you
Take
so
care.
much.
Everybody.
Bye. Safe.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to see you, Larry. Thank you.